Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're telling a story from the edges of the Trojan War, a name you may have heard, but a life that is rarely explored. Hermione, daughter of Helen and Menelaus, born into a war she did not choose, promised and re-promised in marriage as alliances shifted, carried from Sparta to Phthia and back again, and set at the center of quarrels that outlived Troy itself. We'll follow her from childhood in a royal household to the uneasy years after the fall of the city, through her betrothal to Orestes, her marriage to Neoptolemus, and the dispute that pulled kings and gods into the same tangle. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're settling into rest or simply curious about the stories that stand just off stage from legend, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. They remembered her first as a name whispered in palace corridors, the child born to a king who kept his grip on a spear even at feasts, and to a queen whose face had already become an omen. Hermione. The syllables fit easily in a court that prized elegance and iron in equal measure. She was the only child of Menelaus, lord of broad Lacedaemon, and Helen, the woman the poets likened to dawn. In Sparta, a name was a banner and a burden, and hers was both from the very start. The palace that raised her stood on high ground above the Eurotas, all cut stone and sunlight, with colonnades that kept summer heat at arm's length. Here the royal women spun fine wool and watched the training fields below, where boys learned to carry shields before they learned to carry their own doubts. Hermione's earliest steps fell between those two worlds. She learned the tales of her house, as others learned prayers. She was taught to honor the hearth of Zeus and the stern favors of Athena. She studied the economies of a kingdom where horses were prized and iron was common, where river reeds hid waterfowl, and where every hill carried a story about Heracles or the twins who glowed like stars in armor. Her blood braided together two currents of power. Through Menelaus ran the last steady line of Atreus, kings who had learned the price of command when bronze was bright and grudges brighter. Through Helen ran the whisper of divinity. The old men who had seen many winters said Zeus himself fathered her. And though they said it softly, they never doubted. That rumor wrapped itself around the cradle. It gave the infant a strange sanctity and made every visit to the temple a matter watched by curious eyes. Nurses who had grown hard in a hard city passed a little gentler by her door. Sparta was not Athens, and did not intend to be. The women of the city were schooled in the order of the oikos and in the holding of land. They ran estates when husbands were afield, and they measured themselves by strength and poise. Hermione's tutors taught letters and measure, and the clean cadence of Homeric song, long before the epics were bound into a single voice. They taught her to look a petitioner in the eye, and to know how much a promise weighs. She learned that an oath is a chain a ruler loops around her own throat before she closes it around another's. She learned that a guest sits beneath the protection of Zeus, and that a host who fails him invites ruin. In the women's quarters, she knew Helen not as a legend, but as a mother. The poets will tell you that beauty is a gift. The poets rarely tell you what it costs. When Helen walked, the servants stilled. When she spoke, the hearth seemed to burn brighter. Hermione grew amid that brilliance and learned early that light casts a shadow. Admiration is a tide that can lift and drown at once. She loved her mother with a daughter's simple hunger, and still she saw how the gaze of the court slid past her toward the queen. Menelaus was different. He carried the blunt affection of a soldier at rest. He lifted Hermione in his arms as if she were a standard to be kept high. He noted her questions with a grunt that meant approval. He took her to the training field and let her watch the horses drive foam from their bits. At night, he told her of brothers and bargains, of the gods who could make a fool of a king in a single afternoon. The envoys came and went. Spartan wine worked on them all, and Spartan seriousness worked harder. Out of that steady traffic of men with careful smiles came stories of quarrels in Boeotia, a new kindness from Nestor in Pylos, a shipment of tin delayed by storms, and always the latest rumor about Paris, the Trojan prince whose manners were too smooth for men who had learned their courtesy from spears. Hermione listened more than she spoke. A princess has few true friends, and silence is a servant that never betrays a master. There were rituals to keep and seasons to mark. At the Hyacinthia she watched garlands made and broken in honor of the god who dies and returns. At the Carnia she listened to flutes that could make a night feel older than any city. With each festival, the girl who had been a cradle of promises grew into the vessel that could carry them. She learned the forms of alliance in the smallest things. Which wife at court could be trusted to keep a secret? Which priest let a bribe shine through his piety? Which captains stood a little closer to the king than their rank allowed? No one needed to tell her that she was an only child. Every nurse who counted blankets, every steward who counted loaves, and every soldier who counted spears gave her the same sidelong glance. She was a hinge upon which two houses might move. Suitors would come not because she was warm and kind, though she was both, but because to marry her would nudge the balance of the Peloponnese one finger toward this side or that. In the women's court, the old singers spoke of Tyndareus and his clever oath to bind the suitors of Helen to one another. Hermione learned the lesson behind the tale. A wise ruler arms the future against its own storms. A wiser one teaches a daughter to read the weather. The truth that mattered most is simple. Before she had choice, Hermione had duty. The Greeks understood this. The gods demanded it. Her parents understood it too, even when the knowledge put a quiet distance between them and the child who carried their hope. Hermione did not rage against it. She watched. She learned. She kept to the stone coolness of the palace, and to the river light, and to the rare hours when Helen's laughter was only a mother's laughter, and not an omen. Sparta shaped her that way. Steady hands, clear eyes, a heart that could hold grief and not spill. So when the day came that would turn her from a daughter into a token in other men's games, she had already been taught what names mean and what they cost. In a land where promises make kings and break kingdoms, the quiet girl beside the queen was being carved into what her world required. Not a heroine sung for her sword arm, but a hinge upon which stories move. That is a different kind of strength. Sparta breeds both. The first bargain that touched Hermione's life was struck in a quiet room where men spoke softly and the door stood closed to servants. It began with a grandfather who knew that the Peloponnese is a chessboard that never clears, and that daughters of kings are pieces that move entire ranks. Tyndareus had once outwitted a camp of princes when he bound the suitors of Helen by an oath. They swore that whatever husband she chose would be defended by all the rest. That clever thread stitched together a dozen tempers and kept blades sheathed in his courtyard. The same old caution now guided his hand when he looked upon the child of Menelaus and Helen, a girl whose blood joined Sparta to the house of Atreus. He understood what she was worth to peace and to danger. He fixed her future to a name that could hold the realms steady: Orestes. Orestes was heir to Mycenae and Argos, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, nephew to Menelaus, and cousin to Hermione. The match was not made for romance. It was made to seal a seam between two great houses that had stood back to back in wars both mortal and divine. Tyndareus spoke with the certainty of age and the patience of a man who had seen the cost of a poor promise. Menelaus listened. The bargain was simple in its purpose. While Hermione still played with little bronze dolls and learned the market weights of grain, She was promised to the boy whose blood was closest to the power that ruled the Argive plain. The child did not hear the agreement when it was spoken. She felt it in the way the household shifted around her afterward, in the new care with which her name was said, in the guarded smiles that crossed the faces of stewards when they took her to the temple and set a hand on her shoulder, as if steadying a standard on a windy day. The seasons turned. Sparta breathed through its festivals. The Eurotas ran bright in spring and slow in the late heat. Hermione learned to walk the colonnades without making a sound, to read the expressions of envoys as they weighed their words, to mark how a court changes when power hums beneath it. She knew Orestes only through the stories that reached her from Mycenae. He had Clytemnestra's deep eyes, they said, and Agamemnon's way of listening to a room with his shoulders as well as his ears. He practiced with the spear in the yard of the Lion Gate and could sit very still through long evenings of council. The reports did not try to make a poet of him. They made a figure that fit the map. He was a boy built of oath and lineage, a future that made sense beside hers. Then came Paris. He did not arrive as a villain in a stage play. He came as a guest. He came with the smooth polish of Troy and with gifts that caught light like fish in a net. There were men who liked him at once and men who liked him after a second cup of wine. There were women who admired his posture and his honeyed voice and the careful way he weighed a compliment before he gave it. He walked in the court as if nothing in the world could surprise him. He looked at Helen the way men look at the sun when they persuade themselves that their eyes are stronger than they are. Hermione watched the courtiers watch her mother. She saw curiosity become heat. She saw gossip become a path that everyone pretended not to see. The old laws of hospitality are the bones of the Greek house. A guest sits under the gaze of Zeus Xenios. To harm him is to invite a god to one's table with anger in his hands. To betray a host is a worse sin still. Paris broke that bone clean through. He took what had been offered to him for safety and turned it into a theft that would poison families for a generation. The morning he sailed, the harbor sang with lines thrown and knots made tight. The rowers set their backs like men who know the sea and do not fear it. The wind smelled of salt and cedar. Hermione stood beneath the shadow of a column and felt the air change in her lungs. She was 9 years old when her mother left Sparta in another man's ship. The palace made a sound that was not quite a shout and not quite a groan. It was the sound of a body that has been struck and means not to fall. Menelaus was not a man of speeches in grief. He moved through his own hall like a storm that understands its course. There were messengers to send. There were allies to call. There was the memory of Tyndareus's old oath, that smart little cord that now drew a net around every man who had once sought Helen's hand. Nestor in Pylos, Diomedes in Argos, Ajax of Salamis, Odysseus of rocky Ithaca, who would argue and obey in the same breath. They owed a debt, and the debt had come due. The courtyards filled with bronze and horses, and the low music of leather stretched tight. The smell of oil and metal crowded the morning. Hermione learned how quickly a home can become a staging ground. She watched men measure spear shafts by fingertip and forearm. She watched armorers polish greaves until they shone like the sky. She watched scribes bend low over tablets to record stores of barley and wine and salted meat. The queen's chambers stood open and still as a quiet lake. The women moved through them without looking at the bed. It is a strange kind of learning when a child understands that a mother is two things at once, both a person she loves and a piece upon which empires will gamble. The house of Atreus tightened into formation. Agamemnon came to Sparta with his great authority and his heavy, steady silence. He spoke low with Menelaus in rooms that were warm even when the lamps went out. He spoke higher with captains in the yard while horses breathed into the morning. He looked at Hermione as if she were a vessel that must cross through fire without cracking. Clytemnestra came as well and left a scent of cedar and smoke that seemed to linger after she turned a corner. She kissed Hermione's hair and said little. She studied the girl's face with a careful attention that held neither envy nor pity. If there was a measure of warning in her eyes, it was not for a child to read. The betrothal that had set Hermione's path did not change because of a stolen queen. Tyndareus's choice still stood. Menelaus saw that, even in wrath, a king must keep his chains of promise unbroken. To cast aside Orestes now would be to cut a knot that kept two houses bound while the world shook. Yet war breeds new bargains the way a storm breeds waves. On the shore of Aulis and on the long plain of Boeotia, new oaths were spoken and old ones were tested. Menelaus gathered the kings and promised rich reward to those who would sail. He promised glory, he promised booty, he promised the righting of a wrong that had insulted every hearth in Greece. The price of one pledge would haunt his daughter in years to come, though she did not yet know it. That is for another chapter. For now, the old promise held. Hermione of Sparta was still the intended bride of Orestes of Mycenae. On the day her father rode out to join the muster, the palace felt too large for breath. The guards stamped their feet to wake warmth in their legs. Grooms soothed high-strung horses with soft clicks and firm hands. Menelaus came to his daughter without ceremony. He knelt so that his eyes were level with hers. He told her that a king must sometimes leave so that a house may stand. He told her to listen to her tutors and to obey her elders, and to remember that silence can be a shield. He did not speak Helen's name. He set his hand on Hermione's head and held it there until she felt the weight of the touch sink through her hair and into her bones. The king rode. The court exhaled. The harbor that had watched one ship steal a queen now watched 1,000 hulls take to water under banners that snapped like angry birds. The poets would later praise the muster and argue over numbers and divinities and winds. Hermione would remember the sound of oars biting the sea and the way the light trembled on the water as if the god beneath were restless. She would remember the newly empty rooms. She would remember learning how absence becomes a kind of furniture that every household must learn to walk around. She did not weep where people could see her. Sparta does not make a show of tears. She did what she had been taught to do. She watched. She learned. She made herself small and durable, like a clay cup that survives when finer work shatters. The betrothal to Orestes remained a quiet ring on her finger that no goldsmith had forged. Beyond the horizon, men were preparing to kill for causes both noble and petty. At home, the girl who would be queen learned how to carry a promise as if it were a blade she must not drop. The Trojan War began as all wars begin, with a theft and a vow and a river of decisions that no one man could stop once the flood had found its level. In the first spray of that river stood a child of Sparta with a future already bound. Hermione grew taller and quieter. The palace taught her the only lesson it can offer to those who must live through a storm. Hold fast. Keep your feet beneath you. Remember the names that matter. One day they will be spoken again, and when they are, you must be ready to answer. The poets like to say that all great fires begin with a single spark. In Sparta, the spark wore perfume and carried himself like a man who had never heard the word no. Paris came as a guest beneath Menelaus's roof. He came with soft clothes and practiced courtesy, and with a gaze that searched rooms as if they were full of gifts meant for him. He spoke the Greek tongue smoothly for a foreign prince, and he praised Spartan iron and Spartan horses and Spartan wine, with the easy compliments of a man who believes praise is a coin that never runs out. He was shown the halls, the storerooms, the granaries. He walked the colonnades and admired the view across the river valley where reeds bent in a wind that smelled of laurel and wet stone. He was led to the queen. No guide was needed after that. Helen had that effect on visitors. A court that kept its face still learned to be stiller. Servants moved with the quiet that comes when a house knows it is holding its breath. Menelaus was not blind. He had been a younger brother in a dangerous family. He knew the shapes that desire takes when it begins to rot into entitlement. The king watched his guest with the same look he gave to a new sword, weighing balance in the hand and imagining where it might break. The old law of the hearth binds the host to honor the guest, and the guest to honor the house. It is not merely a matter of good manners, it is the seam that holds the world together. Paris cut that seam with a smiling hand. There are versions that argue about how it happened, whether Helen went against her will or followed a voice that promised something the world could not give her in Sparta. The gods stand accused in some tellings, Aphrodite guiding hearts as easily as a woman braids hair. What matters to history is this. The Trojan prince boarded a ship in the Spartan harbor with a queen on his arm and Spartan treasure in his hold, and he let his sailors pull hard on the oars while the wind filled the bright foreign sail. The house that had sheltered him stood behind like a man whose back has been opened by a knife he did not see. Hermione was 9 years old. She learned that day what a void sounds like. It is not a scream. It is an intake of breath that never seems to end. She saw her mother's chambers emptied of jewelry boxes and favorite combs, and small personal things that a queen touches every morning without thinking. A single ribbon left in a bronze bowl looked like a dropped thread that could not be found again once night came on. In the courtyard, the king spoke little. His jaw tightened and his hands opened and closed as if he were gripping reins that were no longer there. Then the work began. When a king is wronged, he does not begin with grief. He begins with letters and messengers and the old craft of calling men to war. The oath of Tyndareus was a clever thing when it was made. It became a chain when Menelaus pulled it tight. Long ago, when Helen chose Menelaus among her suitors, every rejected prince swore to defend her husband if harm touched his marriage. Now the harm had a face and a name, and a number of ships that could be counted, as they vanished into the blue line of the horizon. Menelaus sent word to the lords of Greece. He sent to Nestor in Pylos, the old counselor whose memory carried more of the past than any man alive. He sent to Diomedes of Argos, who was already spoken of as a man who stood as firm in battle as a stone wall in a river current. He sent to Idomeneus of Crete, to the twin Ajaxes of Salamis and Locris, to Menestheus of Athens, to the Boeotian leaders, to the proud men of Thessaly. He sent word to Ithaca, where Odysseus lived with a newborn son and a clever wife, and a mind that found the shortest road through any tangle. The king reminded each of them of the oath that had tasted like wine when it was sworn, and now would taste like iron in the mouth. Agamemnon came down from Mycenae with a train of captains and the weight of command around his shoulders. The older brother wore silence well. He listened to the accounts, he spoke with the priests, he fixed the time and place for the muster. Aulis, where the long beach could hold more ships than any harbor, and where the winds favored those who meant to cross the sea, the summons spread like a slow fire. Across valleys and along rocky paths, through city gates and farm lanes, the call to arms changed what men planned to do with their next year. Spears were taken down, helms were polished. Women counted dried figs and barley, and kissed men who would not see another harvest. Boys boasted and hid their fear. The first ships to nose into Aulis brought gossip as cargo. They told of Achilles, hidden by his mother, among girls on the island of Skyros, a young lion disguised in bright cloth because a mother had learned to fear prophecy. The seer Calchas said no victory could be won without that boy. Odysseus went to fetch him with a trick that would have made Hermes smile. He set weapons among trinkets at a merchant's stall, sounded an alarm, and watched which of the maidens reached for a spear. Achilles laughed when he was found. He joined the muster with a hunger that comes easily to the young. There were other necessities to be faced, and some were darker. The fleet choked at Aulis when the winds died, and the sea lay as flat as beaten bronze. Priests muttered that Artemis had been slighted and would not lift her hand from the air until she was honored. The stories disagree about the cause. Some say Agamemnon boasted of his skill with the bow. Some say a white stag sacred to the goddess had been killed. The solution that reached the king was a horror. Sacrifice Iphigenia, the child of Agamemnon, and Clytemnestra, and the goddess would send wind. What truly happened depends on which poet you trust. Some say the knife fell, and a deer was placed by the goddess on the altar at the last instant, while the girl was carried away to a hidden life in distant Taurus. Others say the king did what kings sometimes do when men are watching, and the stakes are beyond reckoning. Hermione only learned the fragments that reached a Spartan child sent to Mycenae for safety in the years that followed. She learned that her aunt would never forgive, and that a house that swallows blood will one day be made to vomit it up. Back at Aulis, the fleet grew like a forest of masts that creaked even when the air was still. The catalogue of ships would one day count them and set their leaders in orderly lines in a poem. But for those who stood on the sand, it was not a list. It was noise and labor and smell. Oxen lowed as they were slaughtered for the gods. Smoke crawled across the morning and the evening both. Captains staked out their places. The Myrmidons under Achilles polished ashwood that would drive their spears true. The men of Salamis boasted that their Ajax was taller than any rival and stronger than two. The Ithacans followed Odysseus with the calm of men who trust a quiet voice over a shout. You could walk from stern to stern for a long hour without running out of hulls that had been tarred black against the sea. Menelaus moved among the ships with a face that showed nothing but a purpose as hard as the pebble ground of the beach. He spoke with the chieftains who would fight at his side, and he offered due honors to those whose pride needed smoothing. A war is an alliance that must be built every morning. He brought rich gifts for those who would risk the first landing, for men like Protesilaus who would later step ashore before any other and pay a terrible price. He listened when Odysseus argued that strategy sweeter than force would save more Greek sons. He did not ignore Diomedes when the Argive insisted that the point of a spear decides what poets can only sing about later. At the edge of all this stood the reason. Helen was not at Aulis. She was in Troy, in a high room with walls painted in colors that Sparta did not favor. Troy stood behind its ring of stone that the gods themselves were said to have helped raise. Its towers shone in the same light that glazed the shields of Greek captains on a beach far away. Hermes runs between such places, but for men the journey is counted in days of rowing and nights under a sky that makes mortals feel their size. For Hermione, the distance could not be measured. She felt her mother like a song heard from another house. The notes are clear, and the words are lost. Sparta lived on as must any city when the king is away. Hermione learned the names of officials who kept the stores and the names of veterans who kept the watch. She sat with her tutors and finished her lessons, because the world does not pause its schooling for the sake of tears. She spent time with Clytemnestra in Mycenae when storms of rumor grew too strong in Lacedaemon. Her aunt was a parent of a different sort, one who believed that instruction is a kindness even when it hurts. Clytemnestra showed Hermione how accounts are kept and how a queen walks through her own hall as if there were a straight road from the door to the throne, even when men stand in the way. The girl learned what it costs to hold a house firm while the storm looks for cracks. Hermione listened and learned what a war feels like to those who do not hold a sword. It is a hunger that the city feeds day after day with grain and men and patience. It is a long patience that dries the mouth. It is the uneasy knowledge that the gods watch, and that their attention is not always a gift. She studied the maps that the stewards rolled and unrolled on cedar tables. She traced the line of sea between Euboea and the Attic coast, between the Argolic Gulf and the long teeth of the Cyclades, between Aulis and the Troad, where the Scamander runs brown with silt. If you had asked her then where her heart lived, she would have pointed to none of those places. She would have pointed to a door at the end of a colonnade that opened on a room where her mother no longer Saturday. In the 10th summer, the sea did what men had begged it to do. It accepted the weight of 1,000 keels and offered back a steady road of blue. The ships drew out from the beach like geese in a long file, and then opened into a flock that held its shape only as long as the leaders shouted and waved. Sails bellied. Oars dipped and rose. On each deck, men looked back at a shore that would be a memory by nightfall. Some prayed. Some bragged. Some stared at the line of the horizon as if it were a wall and they meant to break it with their eyes. Menelaus stood on the stern of his own ship with his hand on the rail and his mind on a single name. He did not look back. Kings do not often permit themselves that kind of honesty. In Sparta, a girl watched a dot become a speck, and a speck become nothing at all. She had been taught that an oath is a chain, and that a chain holds even when it bites. Now she understood the shape of the bite. A king had left. A husband had been stolen. A continent of pride and piety and calculation had shifted its weight. The world would not be the same when he came home. If he came home, a war at a distance is not a single sound. It is a long braided noise that rises and falls and never fully leaves the ear. Hermione learned to live with that noise. Seasons turned their slow wheels over Sparta, while the fleet drove toward fame and ruin. In spring, the Eurotas shone like hammered silver. In summer, the fields crisped, and the women moved through the heat with the easy strength of those who have done hard work all their lives. In autumn, the presses sang as grapes gave up their first sweet. In winter, smoke curled from the palace kitchens, and the wind carried the smell of wet stone. Through it all came the messages like gulls blown in from a black sea. A name, a victory, a death, a rumor with teeth, then silence again, which was sometimes worse. The court had its rituals and its stubborn pride. Spartan girls were not kept behind screens. They learned to keep pace with the world rather than hide from it. Hermione ran the track beneath the eye of a sharp-tongued tutor and grew lungs that knew how to carry breath without wasting it. She learned the spear cast with a light practice shaft until the arc of it felt like a thought her body made before her mind could frame the words. She learned the lyre for evenings, when men who had seen blood wished for a softer sound. She could recite the family lines that mattered and mark on a wax tablet who owed what in barley after a poor harvest. A princess who could not tally accounts would be a queen who could not command respect. She also learned to read faces. Sparta was plain-spoken, but grief makes liars of the best of us. The steward who took news from a traveler and came to the women's quarters with too steady a tread. The guard whose helmet hid his eyes a heartbeat longer than it should. The priest who poured wine for Zeus in a slower stream. A child raised in waiting grows sharp. Hermione grew that way. She watched Menelaus's captains when they returned on brief errands to the Peloponnese. Their hands told more than their mouths. Scars where there had been none. Skin burnished too brown by Anatolian Sunday. A habit of looking past a person toward a wall as if they could not quite trust anyone to stay still. The first bruising tidings came early. Men talked in low rooms about a duel that should have ended everything before the blood debt grew too large to pay. Menelaus had stood before the Trojan lines with Paris in sight, the plains of Ilion breathing dust under the heat. It was said that the two fought for the right to end the quarrel without drowning a continent in sorrow. Hermione listened to accounts in the courtyard where women mended harness and sorted grain. She learned that her father had pressed the prince, and that Paris had fallen back, and that only the sudden interference of Aphrodite had kept Troy from handing back a queen and an apology. A goddess reached into a fight between men and pulled one away like a mother who refuses to lose a second child. The truce that followed broke apart like stale bread. The war deepened its bite. Years do not pass quietly in the camp of heroes. The muster at Aulis had gathered more than muscle. It had collected pride and prophecy and private grudges. Sometimes those currents help an army move in one direction. Often they drag it several different ways at once. There was a quarrel over a captive girl that cut the Greeks like a reef cuts a hull. Agamemnon had taken a daughter of a priest of Apollo. Achilles insisted she must be returned. The High King yielded, but in the yielding he tore something raw in the heart of the best fighter in the host. Achilles withdrew to his huts, and the world learned what happens when the greatest weapon in a war sets itself down and will not be lifted. Hermione did not stand in that quarrel. She felt it the way a bird feels a storm far inland, the air heavier, the horizon odd. Runners brought word that the Trojans drove the Greeks back against their ships. Fires rose bright enough to be remembered in dreams. Men began to speak the name of Hector with a respect that was almost tenderness. He was said to be a prince who fought for his own hearth rather than for plunder. The Greeks would come to hate and love him as men sometimes hate and love the thing that proves them mortal. In the 9th year, a different sort of news crossed the halls. Patroclus had gone out to fight wearing Achilles' armor. The stories never match, and that is how you know they are true. Some said he meant only to push the Trojans from the ships and then come back to the tents like a tide that flows and ebbs. Others said the taste of success is a spur that presses until a horse forgets that it is tired. He fell beneath a spear and a god's hand, and the camp that had been a forge fire turned for a time into a funeral pyre. Hermione did not know the dead man. She knew what the room felt like when his name was spoken. The voices went soft. The servants moved as if the floor might give way. Sometimes, grief tells you what is coming better than any prophecy. Achilles returned to battle after that, and men started using the old words again. Scourge. Doom. Fate. In Sparta, the women wove linen for priestly robes and placed it before Athena and asked for a wind that would blow their men home when the last body had been covered. The news ran ahead of the return that prayer begged for. Achilles killed Hector. He dragged the body behind his chariot around the walls until even his rage understood it was tiring him more than it punished anyone else. Then came a story that reached even the old women who told fortunes with knotted cords. Priam, the grey head of Troy, walked into the Greek camp alone and took Achilles by the hands and asked for his son's bones. He reminded the younger man of what it means to be a father and a guest and a human being. Achilles wept. He gave back the body. Priam went home with his grief and with the small dignity he could carry. In that exchange, Hermione learned something a harder tutor could never have carved into her. There are rules that stand even when the world breaks. If they fall, nothing built on the dust will last. The war did not end with Hector's pyre. New heroes came to lift the Trojan name. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, rode in from distant lands with companions who laughed at the idea that a spear must be thrown by a man's arm to fly true. Memnon came with an army from the sunrise and fought with a gravity that reminded veterans of tides and winter. They fell. The Greeks found a measure of their own balance again. Then a different blow struck. Achilles died. Paris shot the arrow. Some said Apollo guided its flight. However the tale is told, the Greeks lost the man who made them feel invincible and the Trojans learned that even the greatest light fades when the gods decide evening has come. The armor of Achilles passed to Odysseus in a judgment that upset as many as it pleased. Ajax, the taller and more straightforward of the great champions, could not bear it. His grief turned inward and then turned to a blade. When the news of his death reached Sparta, Hermione understood that a war devours not only the men struck by enemy spears, but also those who cannot find a place for their pride to stand. Some stories came ashore like driftwood. You picked them up and part of them crumbled in your hand and part was sound and strange. A seer named Helenus bribed or captured. A prophecy about a bow that had once belonged to Heracles. A sick man named Philoctetes marooned years ago and now needed after all. Odysseus went and brought him back, and the bow strung in the right hands bent the fate of the war. These were the kinds of details that made wise people smile. Fate loves its details as much as it loves its grand designs. Through all of this, Hermione grew from a girl who kept her voice soft in the presence of elders into a young woman whom stewards consulted without embarrassment. The palace did not flatter her. It gave her lists. It gave her disputes between shepherds about grazing rights. It gave her a question about the repair of a bridge that carts needed for autumn loads. She learned to speak to men old enough to be her grandfathers in a tone that asked for facts rather than deference. She learned to let them keep their dignity when she overruled them. She visited the temples and offered what a princess must offer, but she also stood in the byres and put her hand on the warm flank of a cow and asked a farmer why the yield was lower this year. In that way, her childhood finished its long work. Letters and messengers brought what the camp chose to send. They did not bring the smell of the scamander when it runs high after rain. They did not bring the grit that gets under a greave strap, or the scrape of a chariot axle turning too close to a man's leg. They did bring names that would live when the names of kings were dust. The carpenter who first dreamed the shape of a horse so large that it would command a city's attention. The man who had the patience to count how many men with shields could hide inside it without breathing too loud. The priest who believed his gods would never allow an enemy to trick him, and who learned how wrong a priest can be. But that belonged to the final year, and Hermione did not live in the final year yet. She lived in the long middle where days are a mixture of small economies and steady courage. At times, she traveled to Mycenae to stay among her mother's kin when politics made it wise. Those halls had their own sound. Clytemnestra ruled with a control that was almost invisible, which is the best kind. She listened with her head slightly bent and her hands still. She carried herself like a queen whose husband had given too much to the winds. There was a man in that house whose eyes lingered too long and whose smile made servants choose another corridor. Aegisthus. Hermione learned very young the art of moving past a danger as if you did not notice it while noticing everything. She kept to the women's quarters and to the courtyards where the light made everything honest. She studied how a queen keeps a city alive when the king is far and the gods are unclear. From Mycenae, she returned to Sparta with more than new songs. She returned with a sense of how the Peloponnese tilted. Old rivalries did not rest while the kings were afield. The small lords watched one another with the same careful attention a wolf gives to another wolf. A princess could be used to mend or to break. Hermione did not yet wear a crown, but she had begun to understand what her hand would mean to men who measured land with a bronze rule and the reach of a spear. Sometimes at night she carried a lamp along the colonnade and paused where the stone stayed cool even after a long hot day. She would think of the stories that came from the Troad and the names that shone there. Hector and Andromache who stood on the wall and spoke of their child and of fate as if it were a person sitting with them. Helen on a tower looking east when the morning was clear. Menelaus with his spear point clean and ready, and his jaw set in a line she remembered from her childhood. Odysseus with a plan he did not yet share. Achilles gone, Ajax gone. Priam with a grief that remade him into a figure legends would bow to. The girl who had once measured her world by rooms and gardens now measured it by distances that could not be walked. She did not write poems about it. She slept and woke and did the work that kept a kingdom from becoming a camp of beggars. When the 10th year broke open at last, and the currents began to run faster, Hermione stood as steady as a column that has known earthshakes and stayed upright. She had one certainty amid all the reports that contradicted one another. The war had already taken a decade from Greece, and it would ask for more before it loosened its hand. She was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter both. From Menelaus, she had taken a habit of setting the jaw and moving forward. From Helen, she had taken the knowledge that beauty draws history to it whether or not it wishes to be visited. The world would soon turn back toward her with the same heavy attention it had once turned toward her mother. She would be ready, not because she was eager, but because she had learned that in our country readiness is a form of piety. Troy burned like a sunrise that no farmer would bless, a light that promised nothing but endings. The smoke drifted over the plain and out across the straits, while the victors counted what they had won and what they would never have again. The long war loosened its grip. Ships that had learned every mood of the Aegean turned their prows toward home. They carried bronze and captives, and the hard knowledge that 10 years leaves marks that do not wash away. Among those hulls was the king of Sparta with his wife beside him, and that fact alone turned rumor into a river that ran through every Greek court. Menelaus did not take the short road. The sea has its ideas about who arrives where and when, and the gods lean down and make small corrections with a fingertip. In later winters, Homer would place him in Egypt, welcomed by a wise man named Proteus, and taught how to question the old sea spirit about winds and fates. It is said the king learned the trick of a fresh breeze from that encounter, and came home with the kind of calm a sailor earns only by surviving the day he nearly did not. Whether the story is sung exactly true or only near enough, the lesson fits the man. Menelaus returned to the Eurotas, a little older at the eyes, and a little surer in the way he set his feet on stone. He had wrestled with loss and with weather, and with the thought of a city he had helped to break. He had carried Helen across waters that remembered her first departure, and he had not let go. Sparta met them as a city meets its returning lord. Trumpets, garlands, animals led to altars with polished horns. Wine poured for Zeus, the guardian of hearth and of guest. Laurel hung at doorways, and smoke climbed clean in the still air. Men who had drilled boys a decade earlier now lifted cups in halls, bright with oil lamps. Women who had kept estates and granaries and accounts while their husbands fought set their hair with care and walked to the palace to see what a legend looks like when she comes home. Children who had been babies when the fleet sailed sat quiet at their mother's knees, because even children know when the room belongs to history. Hermione stood in that room with the straight spine Sparta had put into her, and with a pulse that remembered when it beat faster. She had imagined this hour from 9 to 19. She had pictured her mother 100 ways. She had practiced the words a daughter says to a queen and to a woman who left and to a woman who returned. None of it prepared her for the simple fact of Helen. Lamps seemed to make a gentler light near her. Silence gathered and did not feel forced. Helen looked on her child, and for a moment the mother unseated the fable. They touched hands that had not met for a decade. They spoke very little while the court studied what could not be said in public. Later they would speak alone, of smaller things that carry a larger weight. The fit of a sandal, the scent of a comb. The way dawn in Troy comes colder than dawn in Sparta. For now there were the rights due to a queen, and the relief that a daughter hides because a kingdom watches. Menelaus accepted the chorus of welcome as a man accepts a mantle he has worn before. He thanked the elders. He nodded to captains who had kept the borders quiet. He looked at stewards whose careful sums had turned lean seasons into bearable ones. His greeting of Hermione was steadier than it would have been if they had been alone. A king never gives everything away to a hall. Yet his hand stayed on his daughter's shoulder a breath longer than ceremony required, and men who were not fools took the measure of that touch. The world did not pause for their reunion. Word arrived from the north that could not be softened by blessed incense. Agamemnon, High King and brother, had returned to his halls in Mycenae and died beneath his own roof. The name that rode beside his in the telling was Aegisthus, a cousin with an old grievance and a soft voice who had not sailed to Troy. Yet the name that carried the real weight for Hermione was the one the messengers did not speak at first, Clytemnestra, the aunt who had taught her to set a lamp at the right height in a council chamber, the aunt who had stood a little too still when Iphigenia's name was spoken, the queen who had held a city together while the wind snapped at its edges. That woman had taken an axe in her hand and removed her husband from the world. She said she had evened a debt that no court could balance. She said justice sometimes wears a rough garment. The hall in Sparta grew cold as the account was read. After the shock came the old duty that stalks every house born to command. Someone must answer. Someone must dress the wound and keep the limb from dying. Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, had been hidden away when blood hunted blood. Now he stepped back into his father's shadow and followed it into his mother's chamber with a blade that had been honed as much by grief as by stone. Hermione heard accounts that used words like avenger and matricide in the same breath. She was old enough to understand that both were true. The gods do not excuse because a man has cause, nor do they soften what needs to be done. Orestes struck down Aegisthus. He struck down Clytemnestra. He set himself on a throne whose legs had been washed in a family's sorrow. The Furies rose from that act like smoke from green wood. They followed him from room to room. They drove him into fugitive days and shaking nights. Pity and fear found their places in the telling and made a home there. Sparta watched this storm with the impassive face of a city that has tasted storms before. Menelaus offered what aid a brother can offer that does not become interference. He sent trusted men to stand beside Orestes when the fits took him, and to hold back those who mistook weakness for an invitation. He sent gifts to the temples that might be moved to mercy. He sent wise men who knew how to speak to Delphi without sounding like beggars. The words that came back to the Peloponnese were strange in the way that true oracles are. Orestes would find release when a god had been appeased and when a crime had been paid for by a life that was not his own. These were not days for a princess to vanish into song. Hermione ate in the great hall with her father, and she learned how a king sorts griefs into piles that can be acted upon. She stood behind Menelaus when he received envoys who now had a little more nervous sweat on their palms than they would have had a year earlier. A strong Mycenae steadies all Argos. A broken Mycenae tempts more men to test their luck than the gods have patience for. She spoke with Helen in quieter rooms that had known 7 forms of light in the course of a single day. The queen did not pretend that the world had rolled back to the morning of the wedding when everything felt easy. She told her daughter that a house is a living thing. Its memory is longer than ours. It grows into the shape of the treatment it receives. You must feed it with order and with mercy in the right measures. You must decide which kindnesses you can afford and which you cannot. In public, Helen bore herself with a grace that did not challenge and did not submit. She made offerings with a steady wrist. She welcomed petitioners as if each one were the first. She did not hide from women whose husbands would not return from the war her beauty helped to ignite. She did not pretend to absolve them. She listened. She allowed silence to do part of the work. Hermione saw that, and if she had been a poet, she might have written that remorse has a music of its own. She was not a poet, she was a student of rule. She took the pattern into herself. There is a kind of promise that is spoken softly and binds a family. There is another kind that is forged in the furnace of a war and binds a kingdom. The first had come from Tyndareus in a cool room in Sparta when Hermione was a child, and the world still felt manageable. The second was born at Troy, where men spoke under the glare of a sun that showed every scar and every hidden thought. It was there, among tents that smelled of leather and smoke, that Menelaus pledged his daughter to a name that carried thunder, Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. The promise was not a trinket handed across a table. It was a seal upon the alliance that pushed the war from stalemate toward decision. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the shape of it stays true. After Achilles fell, and the best hope of quick victory fell with him, the Greeks turned to every instrument that fate would allow. They brought Philoctetes back with the bow of Heracles. They won oracles with careful bribes and careful piety. They devised the wooden horse with a patience that frightened even those who believed in it. In that long summoning of strength, Neoptolemus arrived from Skyros, young and terrible in the way a spear is terrible when it has not yet learned to bend. He took up the quarrel his father had made famous. He learned quickly which lines to hold and which to break. In the night of the sack, he strode through the palace of Priam, while Troy finally understood the cost of its long defiance. Priam fell at the altar. Andromache, Hector's widow, learned what a conqueror means when he says mercy. The boy had a reputation by dawn. Menelaus was a king who measured a man by more than the volume of his boasts. He watched Neoptolemus work and understood what the presence of Achilles' blood had done to the balance of the siege. The sun brought speed where counsels had been slow. He brought simple courage where grudges had tangled good sense. On such men, a war rests when it wishes to be finished. The Spartan king gave back power with a gift that was not coin and not captured gold. He put his daughter's hand into the scales. In the camp, there were witnesses enough to carry the oath forward until it reached every hall that mattered. Menelaus would grant Hermione to the son of Achilles. The Greeks would see in that pledge a public binding of two houses who had never needed one another more. The war ended. Troy was ash and echo. The Greeks held funeral games for the fallen and argued about the gods under skies that refused to give clear answers. Then they drifted away in their squadrons and pairs and lonely hulls. What is promised in war has a habit of presenting its account in peacetime, when men would prefer to forget what they said. Menelaus did not forget. He came home to a city that had kept discipline for 10 hard years, and to a daughter who had learned to keep her voice steady. It would have been easy to say that old arrangements must stand and the new be quietly set aside. Sparta does not love easy. The king called his daughter to the inner court and spoke to her as one ruler speaks to another when both know they must carry a burden together. He told her of the oath at Troy. He told her that the world would watch to see if a Spartan word is an iron ring or a string that can be pulled apart. He told her that a house earns what people say about it every time it pays a debt on time and in full. No one forgot the pledge to Orestes. Memory in Greece is a ledger that keeps 2 columns open on the same page. The elders could recite the moment when Tyndareus had fixed Hermione to the boy who now sat on a throne that smoked from the fires of revenge. They could also recite the scene at Troy when Menelaus, who had given 10 years to a cause, set the future of his line as reward and guarantee. It was not a simple choice, and it did not feel like a choice at all. Orestes had blood claims and grief that made him dangerous to cross. Neoptolemus had the recent benefit he had given to every Greek who sailed. Menelaus gave more weight to the oath that had kept the army together at the end. In that arithmetic, he was as much priest as father. The court's talk followed its own rules. Some favored the old betrothal as a kindness that might soothe the house of Atreus and calm the furies that dogged Orestes. Some favored the new pledge as the only coin that could buy respect from every shoreline that had watched Troy fall. Helen did not stand to address the hall. She spoke to her daughter in rooms that smelled of cedar and oil, and the faint trace of salt that never seems to leave the hair of a woman who has lived at sea. She did not pretend that the choice was kind. She did not ask Hermione to be happy. She asked her to be steady. A queen, she said, is a vessel for more than her own wish. She is a bridge between houses. She must carry weight without cracking, and she must not resent the hands that set the stones in her. The words were both comfort and instruction. Hermione heard both. Gifts left Sparta to mark the match before the bride left her father's roof. Cloaks woven in the city's strict patterns. Bronze work from men who had learned a good edge from a bad one in years, when bad edges meant death. Fine oil for Peleus's house in Phthia, where the old man sat like a pillar that had watched a temple rise and burn and rise again. There was a formal embassy to Phthia to greet the grandfather of the groom and to say aloud what all Greece had already learned. Spartan kings do not break their word. Neoptolemus answered with gifts of his own that carried the style of men who had learned to live fast. Horses with the smooth flanks of river stones, a sword that had belonged to a captain of the Myrmidons and which had marked the end of many Trojan sentences. The day of departure came with the simple inevitability that follows great vows. The palace court was swept clear until its stones held the light the way a cup holds water. Musicians stood ready with airs that honored the gods and quieted men's hearts. Priests of Hera and Athena set their hands on the bride and asked the goddesses to look with favor on a union that would knit together bloodlines and keep the Peloponnese from tearing itself along old seams. The city's women came to stand near the colonnade and watch Hermione walk the length of the court. There is a posture that all queens learn. It is not pride. It is not submission. It is the way one moves when many watch and all must be given a little truth to carry away. Hermione had learned it in long practice, and now she wore it without effort. Menelaus stood beside her at the last. He did not speak long. He did not apologize. He said that a king who eats his word grows thin in a way no meat can fatten. He said that a daughter of Sparta is not a parcel to be pushed across a board, but a standard that stands where it is planted. He promised her that she would not be forgotten in the city that had made her. Then he set her hand into the charge of the envoys who would conduct her first to Phthia, and then on to the country that Neoptolemus now ruled. Helen fixed a veil that let Hermione see the road, while letting the room look at the bride. She kissed her child, and for a moment looked like a woman who remembered a different day when she had walked toward a voyage, and had not guessed how long it would be before she stood in her own doorway again. The river knew her steps as she went to the waiting litters and horses. The women who had trained with her watched the lift of her chin and took it for themselves. Boys in the forecourt stood still in the way boys do when they sense that a scene will be told back to them when they are old. The gate swung inward, because Sparta always opens itself to friends and closes against enemies. The procession turned to the road that would lead first to Amyclae, and then to the mountain passes, and then to the coast, and the ship that waited. The people said her name once, as if to lay it like an amulet upon her. Hermione did not turn. A queen does not look back while a city is watching. Fear received her with a mix of respect and calculation that any powerful house will give a royal bride. Peleus welcomed her with the courtesy of an older generation that had seen heroes rise and fall and understood that marriages can steady a world that refuses to remain steady under the hand. The hall that had known Achilles as a boy now set a chair for his son's wife. Hermione learned the maps of a new country and the temper of a new court. She learned the shape of a shoreline where ships came in with stories from Euboea and from the holy places near Delphi. She learned which captains had become loyal to Neoptolemus for love of his courage and which for love of his success. The difference matters. She learned the faces of servants who had grown up within those walls and who could tell her what the house liked and what it punished without raising its voice. News moved, as it always does. It said that Neoptolemus had settled his affairs in Thessaly and Epirus and would soon come to claim what had been promised. It said that he had made offerings at the tomb of his mother Didamia and spoken aloud the names of men who had died beside him at the fall of Troy. It said that he moved with the air of one who expects doors to open. Some called that arrogance. Others called it the due of a man who had ordered the last page of an epic written and watched the gods turn it. In those weeks before he placed his hand upon hers, Hermione did the work that keeps a palace from becoming a theater for other people's ambitions. She sat with the house steward and asked to see the accounts for the year before the war and the year after. She asked where supplies had come from when storms had closed the mountain passes. She asked which villages kept their own justice and which needed a firmer hand. She learned the names of the local gods whose small shrines do more to steady a province than the grand temples make poets sing about. She asked after the old king's health with a frequency that signaled both respect and a reminder that Sparta now had eyes in these rooms. When Neoptolemus came at last, he came as men say a fire comes down a slope after a pine grove has taken the first spark. He greeted her in public with the formality required, and in private with the short speech of a soldier who prefers deeds to words. He did not pretend to be gentle. He did not pretend to be something the war had not made him. He promised her honor. He promised her a throne that had been held by men whose names needed no embroidery. He promised her a place at his side in a court that would grow from the seed of victory into a tree men would come to in summer for shade. The oath that had been spoken at Troy had reached its harvest. Hermione had left the city that shaped her to keep a promise that would shape the next years of Greece. She stood now within a house that had trained Achilles and would test his son, a house where the old man Peleus remembered a time before the Iliad had been born, and the young Lord Neoptolemus believed with his whole heart that the world would move as he moved it. Between those two stood the daughter of Menelaus and Helen, a woman who had learned to carry the weight of other people's choices without bowing and to make her own choices count when the hour allowed. The road that carried Hermione from Phthia to her husband's country climbed out of Thessaly and ran west into hills that made a different music when the wind moved. The sea slipped away behind her. Pines took the place of olives. Valleys opened like cupped hands and then closed again under rock that looked as if Titans had set it down when they tired of building. Men called this borderland Epirus, rough and old and proud. It was a country where strangers were weighed by their behavior before they were weighed by their lineage. News runs slowly through mountains. Honor runs fast. Neoptolemus met her in those passes with a retinue that carried the stamp of his wars. There were Myrmidons who had pulled down Troy's doors and who wore their scars the way other men wear brooches. There were Molossian chiefs who had ridden at his shoulder since he first set his eyes on the western heights and said that the place would answer to him. He greeted Hermione with the public solemnity owed to a queen and with the spare words of a commander who had learned to conserve speech the way a good soldier conserves water. He was broad across the chest and quick when he turned. The name Pyrrhus suited him, the Red One, and it pleased men who like things to mean what they say. He wore victory without apology. He wore the memory of his father without needing to mention him. Peleus did not ride so far. Age had set him in Phthia like an old oak near a river ford that has seen the coming and going of more caravans than any scribe could count. But his word went with them, full of the courtesy of a generation that had learned to speak before it learned to command. A chair stood for Hermione at each halt, and sacrificial cakes waited at each small roadside shrine. It was a lesson wrapped in kindness. The daughter of Sparta would be honored on this road, and at its end. Host and guest would keep the old laws, not because a priest watched, but because men remembered what happens when they forget. They crossed into the lands that Neoptolemus had pulled together since the fall of Troy. The countryside carried the signs of a new rule. Stockades were coming down where garrisons had been needed in the first quick months. Storehouses stood under fresh thatch. In the valleys, shepherds began to trust that their flocks would not be levied without cause, and that any levy would be paid for with fair coin. The king's men kept to the roads with a measured tread. Hermione noted those things, the way a woman trained to rule keeps a private ledger in her head. Promises made in war no longer bled the farms. Men had lost brothers and sons in Asia. They would not watch their fields die of neglect at home. His seat lay between the mountains and the Ambracian Gulf, a hall built stout rather than fine, with rafters blackened by years of smoke and a forecourt paved in river stone. The women set wreaths on the doorposts, and the priests of Zeus greeted the queen with the briefest prayers, since long prayers breed suspicion in a hard country. From the threshold she could see the yard where horses rolled their smell into the earth, and where spear shafts leaned like orderly trees. A queen does not need tapestries to know the temper of a hall. She needs the sound of men at work, and the smell of the granaries, and the way servants glance at their masters when they think no one is watching. Hermione walked what would be her kingdom, the way a surveyor walks a new border. She went first to the storerooms and to the workshops where bronze was hammered and leather cured. She spoke without hurry with the steward who had survived 3 masters. She asked what had been done to bind hill villages that gave trouble when a stranger bore the title of king. She asked which clans met justice with a level stare, and which needed a heavy hand at first light. She paid her respects at the shrine of the god at Dodona, where the oak leaves speak if you have the will to hear them. There the priests listen to the wind in the sacred branches and cut meaning from the murmur. In that grove, Hermione learned how a people who distrust eloquence still talk with heaven. The oracle answered as oracles do, in sentences that will fit both the road you intend to take and the road you end up on. The marriage feast lasted the proper days and gave the proper measure of wine and slaughter. The chiefs of Epirus were men who respect a cup that is not watered, and a host who does not count the joints of a goat too carefully. Neoptolemus made his gifts in public. He gave bracelets worked by Thessalian men who knew how to make metal look like vine. He gave horses, since to give a horse is to tell a man you expect him to ride at your side. Hermione returned those courtesies with care. She sent fine oil to wives who had seen their husbands killed in the last lean year. She sent cloth to old men who made speeches in the assemblies, and who must be made to talk of Spartan generosity in the weeks after the wedding. She allowed herself to be seen on the steps, and in the yard, and at the altar, a figure steady in all weathers. She asked names and then remembered them, which is a work of statecraft that looks like kindness and is both. In private, the marriage found its rhythm as marriages do when 2 strong houses knot the rope and then must learn to walk without tripping over it. Neoptolemus did not pretend to be gentle, and so he did not have to apologize for not being so. He did not ask his wife to like the men who shared his counsel. He asked her to tell him which of them lied poorly and which lied well. She told him, and her ledger grew. He listened with the half-smile of a man who had learned in hard schools that good advice should never be punished for being inconvenient. He gave her the keys to the granaries and the right to hear petitions beside him in court on certain days. He filled the house with a pace that came from the campaign ground. Things were decided quickly and revisited only when they must be. He rose with the dawn and expected the same of others. He laughed rarely. When he laughed, the sound came from deep in the chest and made the dogs lift their heads. The court itself took on a new shape under the press of former enemies, folded into the daily work. There were Greeks from the east who had followed their captain home, a few spared by fortune who had no house left on the other side of the sea. There were Epirotes who had never seen the Scamander and cared as little for tales of Hector as a farmer cares for battles fought a day's walk from his field. There were craftsmen who learned to copy Thessalian patterns and then learned to improve them, the way pride pushes a hand to do more than imitate. There were bards who had been boys when the fleet sailed and now sang of Troy with a longing they had not earned, and bards who had seen too much and sang those same songs for coin because the world expects a meal to be paid for. It was in this breathing house that Hermione's eyes met the woman who would mark her days. She had known the name long before she saw the face, Andromache. In Troy, she had been a wife whose counsel held a prince steady on the wall. In Epirus, she wore the marks of defeat with a dignity that was not learned in any hall. The Greeks called her captive. The servants called her lady in the low voice, used for those who have fallen farther than a polite tongue can say. Neoptolemus had taken her from the ruin of the city as the men of that age took their prizes, and he kept her now beneath his roof as both concubine and proof that his hand had reached the heart of his enemy. There is an honesty in such arrangements, and there is a cruelty. The house learned to live with the truth and tried to hide the cruelty under better manners. Andromache did not flinch when Hermione entered the women's court. She bowed her head and held it there just long enough to make courtesy visible and not long enough to make it a wound. Her child was sometimes at her side, a boy with eyes that watched everything. Men named him Molossus in the years that followed and made him an ancestor to justify a dynasty. For the moment he was a sturdy creature with a quiet mouth, and the women clucked over him as women will when a child appears where war has left few. Hermione greeted him with the grace due to a seed that might one day grow into a branch that could shade the court or pierce it. She offered Andromache small generosities that cost nothing, and some that cost a little more. Places at table, moments by the hearth where no one would ask her to speak of walls and fire, a new comb carved by a local man who learned his art from a Thessalian, and then put the mountains into it. There was, in the first months, a balance that could almost be called peace. Hermione was a queen trained by Sparta to carry duty like a beam across her shoulders without complaint. Andromache was a woman trained by loss to accept what could not be changed and to keep some secret inner court where no conqueror could walk. The house shaped itself to their presence. Servants learned which evenings the queen preferred plain food and which days the Trojan woman needed a longer time at the loom to keep her thoughts from breaking the surface. Neoptolemus passed between their worlds with the impatient ease of a man who believes the largest matters are decided in council and in battle, not in rooms where women speak low. Still, under the surface of courtesy, currents ran. The young queen had a city at her back and a lineage that glittered in the mouth of any singer. The Trojan woman had a throne's memory in her bones and a dead husband's name that still drew reverence from men who had once tried to kill him. The childless wife looked at the child of another and told herself that she was above such measuring, and most days she was. Then came the days when she was not. There are two kinds of patience. One is the patience of a hunter who knows the quarry will come to water. The other is the patience of a woman who waits for a blessing that no skill can snare. Hermione had the second. She wore it well. It wore her down. So the year turned in Epirus, among steep paths and old stones, and a sky that could change its mind 3 times between sunrise and noon. Men spoke of Dodona and the will of Zeus that shook the leaves. They spoke of raids turned back along the Thesprotian border and of a new storehouse raised near the river to keep grain dry for winter. They spoke less of the quiet in the women's court, where 2 lives learned to hold their places without stepping on each other, and where another life grew tall enough to reach for a stool without help. Hermione learned the taste of a land that respects silence more than speech. She learned to let the mountains finish sentences for her. She learned that not all victories look like the ones sung in the old halls. Some look like a house that does not split when it creaks. On evenings, when the wind came down clean from the passes, the Queen would walk the forecourt alone and look up at a sky clustered with stars she had first learned to name in Sparta. Some of those lights marked the shapes of men who were now salt and story. Achilles among them, Ajax too, Priam warm in the pity of every winter fire. She would lower her gaze to the dark line of roofs and think of the women within them, each keeping her own small flame alive, and each telling herself that tomorrow would be easier. A queen is not permitted to say that aloud. She keeps the hope because others must borrow it in the morning. Here the story takes a breath. What had been in balance would not remain so. A house can bear a great deal if its beams are sound. Jealousy is a worm that does its work inside the wood. A king's journey to a holy place will soon set the stage for what cannot be mended. Before that hour, remember this one. A Spartan princess stood where the mountains meet the sea and believed, for a little while, that duty and order might be enough. There is a sickness that does not show in the skin. It begins with a look that lingers a heartbeat too long and grows in the quiet between words. In Epirus, that sickness found a bed in Hermione. She had been taught to bear weight without bending, and to take the long view when men around her were drunk on this hour or the next. She had been taught to keep a keen ledger. Now the entries were not grain and bronze, but glances and the smallest of courtesies. A child laughed in a corridor, and the numbers moved against her. The patient accounting of a queen turned into the fever counting of a woman who cannot sleep. It is not a sin to want a child. It is not a crime to fear that one will never come. A house keeps that kind of fear like a jar of oil at the back of a shelf. No one speaks of it, and yet everyone knows where it island. Hermione rose with the dawn and asked the household gods for favor. She laid offerings before Hera, and before Artemis, and before the local spirits whose names the old women did not share with strangers. Month followed month, and nothing changed. Andromache moved through the court with a composed gravity that no insult could shake, and a boy trotted at her side, like a small, proud shadow. Men began to speak the boy's name more often in the yard, and less often in the modest voice they had once used. Molossus. The name fitted the country, and pleased men who like a future they can picture at table. Hermione told herself that the boy was not her enemy. On most days, she believed it. Then there were the mornings when she looked in the bronze mirror and measured the strength of her own face and felt a narrow heat run along her ribs. It was not logic. Logic rarely wins when the heart decides to fight its own war. The Trojan woman had given a son to the house. The Spartan queen had not. Men say the oak at Dodona speaks in the wind. The wind in the women's court spoke even when it was still. The accusation came, as such accusations do, formed in the mouth before the mind can stop it. Hermione said that Andromache had put spells upon the marriage bed, that she had mixed herbs that bend the favor of Hera, and had called on shadows that slip through a house when its lamps are low. The word was a sharp one that had been used for centuries to explain what men and women cannot bear to admit. Pharmaca, charms. A poison of the will rather than of the blood. The scandal rolled through the court and along the lanes of the town in the measured steps of gossip that knows it has found a good road. Andromache stood and let the gust strike her. She said only that she had not forgotten the gods of Troy, and that she would never forget what had been taken from her there. She said a woman who has wept for a city does not waste her tears on clever little lies. Hermione was not content with denial. Jealousy does not seek truth, it seeks relief. She sent a message south along the mountain ways that carried her father's name in wax and her own hand in the lines of the script. Menelaus answered the call as a king answers when a daughter says that honor is at stake. He came with a small guard and with the better habit of a lifetime in courts. He listened to Hermione in a private chamber where the light fell clean and the floor was cool. He listened to the overseer of the women's court, and to two servants whose eyes moved like minnows, and to one priest who looked at the floor because he disliked the business and liked the king. Then Menelaus did what kings do when the path before them is mostly made of fog. He took a strong step in the direction of his blood. Andromache was seized at dawn while the household began to stir, and the sun only just reached the yard where dogs stretched and yawned. Hermione gave orders that were spoken in a voice steady enough to look like justice. Guards took the boy from his pallet and carried him to the inner court. They set mother and child before the queen. Menelaus stood a little to one side with his hands quiet and his face turned toward duty. Andromache found herself almost relieved. Fear is a whetstone. Anger is a shield. Clarity comes even to the beaten when the choice is laid before them. "Yield the child," said the queen. "Confess what you have done to my house and to my bed and to my life, or watch me erase your future before your eyes." Something in the Trojan woman straightened then, as if a bar had run down from the back of her skull to the base of her spine and become iron. She looked at the Spartan king and then at the Spartan queen. She spoke as one who has already learned what loss can and cannot take. She said that a captive can be made to kneel, but truth will not. She said that any harm done to the boy would bring down a curse that no altar could lift. Hermione answered with the simple words of a ruler who believes that mercy has grown too costly. She ordered the guards to pull the child away. She had knives near at hand in case the will of the room faltered. She had men who would obey because they knew their pensions were at stake, and because the habit of obedience is as strong as a prayer muttered every day since childhood. The court might have blackened its own heart that morning, had not the door opened to a voice that carried the weight of other years. Peleus came in behind that voice like a yard of winter cloud that does not need thunder to command respect. The old man had left Phthia more quickly than his age should have allowed, and the journey had put a hard edge on his temper. He did not bow to the king of Sparta. The old know their rank, without titles. He spoke as a father of a greater king, and as a man who once had a goddess in his bed and learned how small any mortal looks when he pretends to judge like a god. He took in the posture of the guards and the set of Hermione's mouth and the rigid stillness of Andromache. He named the intention before anyone else dared to speak it. "You mean to murder this woman and her child and call it order?" Menelaus did not flinch. He said that he meant to protect his house and the oath given to the son who now sat where Achilles once had. Peleus cut him off with a gesture that had stopped better men in their tracks. He said that kings who murder women and children in their own courts do not protect houses, they rot them from within. He said that even in the last year of the old ages there are rules left that separate us from the beasts that chase our herds. He told Hermione that envy is a poor priest who mistakes smoke for prayer. Menelaus could have taken offense and pressed the matter. He was a warrior whose pride had weathered 20 bad winds. But he had been raised among men who knew how to turn aside rather than break a beam they would need tomorrow. He stepped back from the brink. He did not apologize. He did not need to be told twice. The guards loosened their grip. Andromache took her boy into her arms without a cry. A room that had been all breath and blade took a breath again. Peleus set the law of his house plainly. The Trojan woman would live under his protection, and the child as well. If any sought to cross that line, they would answer to a man who had buried a son and would not see his grandson's hall stain itself for the sake of a quarrel in the women's court. Hermione stood under that judgment like a pillar in a sudden squall. She did not lower her eyes. She did not weep. She learned a different lesson that morning. One Sparta teaches as sternly as any city. To be wrong and to be prevented from doing a wrong are both hurts the proud must survive. When Neoptolemus heard of the scene, he did not storm through the house with curses. He rode out the next day to make a vow on a road that led toward the center of the world. Delphi lay east beyond the passes, a holy place that hears too much and answers too little. There Achilles is named as often as Apollo. In one telling the son went to ask the god for satisfaction for the father. In another he went to make amends to the god his father had cursed in dying. In either case, he left the house with the quiet of a man who has chosen a path and does not plan to explain it. Silence can be a kindness. It can also be the last door that closes between two people who had meant to share one room all their lives. Hermione watched him go with a face that the court had learned to read and fear. The mask did not crack until the hooves were a memory. Then the fear came. It came not for her honor, but for her skin. The attempt against Andromache and the boy would not stay within the women's court. It would return to her when her husband returned to the threshold and asked what had been done in his absence. She was not afraid of loud words. She had grown up in a city where men argue like hammers. She was afraid of the quiet that follows a judgment. She was afraid of the moment when Neoptolemus would look upon her and find not a queen, but a danger to his house. Into that fear came a name that had waited for years in the ledger and now wrote itself across the page. Orestes. He came to Epirus, marked by his own storms, hunted by the Furies, and yet steadied at last by Apollo's word, and by a verdict that men still argue about when the lamps burn low. He had known Hermione as a betrothed that fate had taken from him. The child promise now grown to a woman who stood like polished stone. He found her pale and very calm, and understood at once that calm is sometimes the last shelter a person builds for herself. There are stories that make of this meeting a complete conspiracy, planned in detail long before footsteps sounded in the same corridor. That is more tidy than life. Orestes had means. He had a claim that old men could be made to repeat in public. He had the will of one who has already crossed too many lines to fear another. Hermione had a need and the pride of a woman who refuses to be paraded in chains within her own house. He urged her to leave with him before Neoptolemus stood again in the yard and balance turned to retribution. She hesitated. There is a chain in every well-taught heart that pulls toward the oath already given. Then she looked at the door through which a child had been dragged and at the stool where a Trojan woman had nearly watched a murder become law. She remembered a grandfather's promise and a father's second pledge, and the long years in which her own need had been the last column in other people's sums. Hermione went with Orestes. The flight did not sound like a hunt in the yard. It sounded like the careful steps of servants who know when to look the other way. It sounded like a small escort riding at a pace that does not stir dogs to bark. It sounded like the breath of a woman who has chosen, and now must learn the price of that choice. Behind them, Peleus stood in his court with a face carved from the same stone as the mountains, and thought of his son and of a temple far away, where answers are written in blood as often as in smoke. Andromache sat in a quiet room and held her boy, and did not think of blessings. She thought of how very narrow the bridge had been, and of the fall that had not come. In the queen's chambers a comb lay where a hand had dropped it, teeth up, catching the light of a window that had been left unlatched to let the air move. So the three great strands drew tight. The son of Achilles moved toward Delphi with the hot memory of insult and the cold purpose of a man who believes the gods can be made to admit their share of guilt. The son of Agamemnon rode south with the daughter of Menelaus under his protection, and with old words ready in his mouth for judges who love to hear their own judgments echoed back at them. The Trojan woman stayed where she was, and learned again the art of enduring. The house in Epirus went on breathing. The mountains stood. The leaves at Dodona whispered what they always whisper. Men call it prophecy. Women call it weather. The road to Delphi begins as a soldier's road and ends as a pilgrim's staircase. Neoptolemus took it with a small company and a silence that made the horses place their feet more carefully. Behind him lay a house that had nearly bled itself on its own threshold. Before him rose Parnassus with its pale ribs of stone and its dark clothing of firs and pines. Men told two tales about his purpose, and both fit the cut of the man. In one he went to accuse a god. In the other he went to make peace with one. He had inherited too much fire from Achilles to enjoy apology, and too much pride to enjoy restraint. They rode by the old road that threads the folds of the mountain like a line drawn by a patient hand. Villages turned out to stare at the red-haired king who had walked through the palace of Priam while the smoke was still learning the rafters. Boys pointed at the scars on the shields of his guards. Old women crossed themselves with a gesture that was not quite Christian and not quite pagan, the way mortals bless their fear against anything that looks too much like fate in a man's clothing. News raced ahead, because news does not need horses. Delphi felt the rumor before it heard the hoof beats. Delphi sits where stone remembers the sea, and the sky agrees to come down to touch it. The Castalian spring runs cold from a cleft in the rock, and gives water that priests call holy and soldiers call clean. The laurel stands in ordered groves that remember Daphne and her flight. The omphalos sits in its place like the earth's own navel, worn smooth by eyes and by time. It is a place for small steps and careful breaths, where even kings walk softer. Neoptolemus came out of the trees and saw the steep climb, the terraces with their treasuries that shine in the sun, the long stair that breaks a man's stride and forces him to think in measured beats. He did not slow. Pride has its own pace. The Pythia does not speak for any man who arrives in a hurry. She speaks when the god has settled in her bones like winter in a cave. The priests met the king in the lower court with words that had learned the weight of centuries. They offered laurel. They offered water for the proper washing. They offered time. Neoptolemus accepted the forms the way a swordsman accepts the small cuts that lead to the larger wound he has come to inflict. He bathed in the Castalian spring. The water ran from his arms in bright ropes and gathered in the basin where countless men had watched their own faces blur. He put laurel on his head and walked where men walk when they wish to be near a god. Here stood the treasuries, little temples built by cities that wanted Delphi to remember their victories. The Athenians had set up their gifts with that careful grace Athens favors, Doric lines that talk more than they sing. The men of Sicyon had offered bronze that keeps its color like a held breath. The islanders had brought gold that looked like sunlight trained to obey. Neoptolemus climbed through that avenue of pride and saw a mirror of what men think will please a god. He was a soldier. He knew better. The god is pleased by fear and by correct words and by the knowledge of one's size. It was not his way to know his size. He had stood over Priam in the night of Troy and held an old man's jaw in his hand and watched the eyes go from rage to pleading, to a kind of dignity that makes a younger man feel a little smaller, even while he does what he came to do. He had dragged that memory across 2 seas and into a house that tried to learn gentleness under a roof that bragged of iron. Now he stood beneath Apollo's image and thought of Achilles cut down by a weapon no spear could have deflected, because the arm that bent the bow was not human. He thought of the arrow that had found the heel, and of the rage that had burned the air when the camp learned. Men blame the god when they are tired of blaming themselves. Neoptolemus had been tired for a long time. The priests guided him to sacrifice. A white ram whose horns had been gilded was led to the altar, and the blade bit clean. Smoke went up in a column that shifted and leaned, and left the priests to decide which way the god had set his face. The king watched the curl of it with a tight mouth. He told them what he had come to say. Achilles died by treachery. If there is justice in the bright house on high, then let it be spoken at Delphi for those who still kneel when they enter the court. If there is mercy, let the hand that sent the arrow ease its grip and hold back what has gathered over my house. He did not say the words softly. The mountain carries sound. Men on the lower terrace looked up, and the guards shifted their shields as if a sharper wind had found the steps. There is law at Delphi that is older than law in any city. A suppliant who takes the god's rope is to be spared. A quarrel is to be left at the foot of the stair. Blood is to be kept outside the sacred line. The priests speak this law with the calm of men who have repeated it at births and at funerals, and at those hard hours when men try to drag their own hate into holy ground. Neoptolemus knew the law. He had flouted better laws in worse nights. He did not come to be turned away by an older man's tone. He demanded audience with the Pythia and demanded it now. The god is not a steward to be called from his ledger because a visitor grows impatient. The priest Macaerius raised a hand the way a man raises a hand to still a dog. A soldier behind Neoptolemus shifted the weight of his spear from palm to palm. No blood yet, only the sound of footsteps. Orestes arrives in some tellings at this point, as quiet as smoke in a hall, and just as real. In those versions he had followed Neoptolemus like a shadow that knows what time the sun will go down. He had spoken with certain priests who do not mind the weight of another man's gold if it is placed on the scale with the right liturgy. He had found a way to bring his case inside the circle of the god, where he would not need to lift a blade to bring the blade down. In other tellings, Orestes was not yet there, or was there as a mere rumor, and Neoptolemus made his own enemies before anyone else needed to lift a hand. Greek stories grow like vines on the same trellis. The shape is true, however the leaf curls. A young king pressed a god. The sanctuary pressed back. Delphi has its own garrison. The sacred precinct is not defended only by old men with ash sprinkled on their hair. There are men there who know how to hold a gate and how to take a blow without letting the spear line break. Neoptolemus sensed them before he saw them. He felt the presence of soldiers the way one hunting dog recognizes another. He understood that this beautiful city of offerings and poems had iron behind it that did not need to declare itself. He had grown up among men who considered that admirable. He also had grown up among men who consider it a challenge. He climbed the last steps to the temple porch where the great doors stand carved with scenes of gods and of mortals who sometimes forget the difference. The smell of bay leaves and old smoke lives in those timbers. The shadows are cool even in noon Sunday. Somewhere within, the Pythia breathed with the slow, careful rhythm of one who has learned to share a body. The king stood before the lintel and told Apollo what no sane man tells a god. You took my father. I have carried that fire long enough. Set it down. Make a sign. Grant me a pardon or grant me a payment that makes a father's end make sense. He lifted his hands. He did not shake. A hush came that was not the hush of reverence. It was the hush of men who know that the next sound decides whether they eat supper with their families or lie on a slab while the crows teach their children what death smells like. The priest answered with a sentence carved by generations. No mortal receives his due at Delphi by threat. The god gives or withholds as the god chooses. The right posture is supplication. The right words are those that remember debt rather than claim credit. The right payment is the sacrifice offered with a whole heart. Neoptolemus took one pace nearer, which was a wrong answer and a proud one. And the wrong answers began to multiply like fish in floodwater. Word of Hermione's flight had reached him on the road, not with certainty, but with the kind of careful repetition that men use when they want to be believed without being blamed. A queen had left Epirus under escort. A certain Argive prince had been seen where he had no business being seen. Men who knew the lineaments of grudges could draw the shape without ink. That news had settled under Neoptolemus's ribs like a stone. It weighed every movement, but it did not slow them. A man who has been taught since boyhood that the straight line is the simplest truth will walk the straight line even into a wall. He brought that stone into the god's house. So he stood between anger for a father and anger for a wife, and anger for the shape in which fate had set his own life. He stood before a god who enjoys rules that mortals must obey to the letter and does not always obey them himself. He heard priests speak law at him as if iron could be broken by talk. Behind him the guards shifted again, and a hand that had been near a sword hilt for a while fell away from it as the owner decided he preferred to live to eat another dinner. On a lower terrace, a merchant from Corinth asked his servant who the red-haired man was, and the servant whispered that this was the son of Achilles, which is to say this was someone who could make a mistake so grand that poets would feast on it for 3 generations. No blood yet, only a pressure in the air that made men swallow. The omphalos sat with its harmless shape and its terrible meaning. The laurel stirred in a wind that might have been a god moving through leaves, or might have been the mountain reminding men how small their breath island. If Orestes was there, he watched. If he was not there, the god watched, which is worse. Neoptolemus spoke again, and the voice that had set men running in the streets of Troy did not crack. He asked for justice. He asked for release. He did not kneel. In the sacred places of Greece, the line between pride and blasphemy is drawn with a pen that looks very much like a spear. The point arrived at its mark without yet breaking skin. A priest extended his arm and denied entrance. A guard bristled at another guard. A king remembered a father's howl on a shore where men beat their chests because they had no other way to claw the sky. The next step would be the step men tell their sons about, when they teach them that the gods will let a man come close so that the lesson will be remembered. The sanctuary held its breath. The mountain held its breath. The men on the porches looked down at their feet, because the worst things often begin with something as small as a foot set wrong on a stair. The first cut in holy places is often made by a word. The second is made by a gesture that refuses to be mistaken. Neoptolemus set his foot across the polished threshold as if a king's weight could tilt a god's balance. Macaarius the priest barred him with an arm made steady by years of ceremony and by the knowledge that an old law stood at his back. The attendants closed in with that hush which announces danger more clearly than a shout. The Pythia's chamber breathed its slow breath beyond the doors. Laurel hissed in a faint draught like rain on bronze. What happened then hangs on which singer you trust. Some say the young king seized the god's rope to demand his hearing, and so made himself a suppliant of the very power he accused. Others say he reached for the inner door, and the priest's staff struck his wrist and rang like metal struck on rock. There are voices that insist no mortal hand began it. They tell that Apollo's anger grew hot in the shaded court and ran like a hunting fire through devout minds. The temple servants fell upon the intruder as one body. Macaarius brought the blade down because the god required it. In those tellings, the blow was not clean. It was ardent and frightened and full of the terror that men feel when they are certain they act for heaven. There is another line of the tale. It runs quieter and cuts deeper. Orestes had come before him by secret paths, or had moved behind him like dusk that keeps its distance and arrives just the same. He had learned the corridors and the ways of payment that are not coin. He had learned which doorkeeper would let a man pass if the god's dignity could be protected afterward by ritual words and proper fines. When Neoptolemus pressed the porch and put scorn in his voice at a god who does not. "Speak," said the Argive by the altar. Down came the blow. Steel in a crowd moves like a thought that someone tries to forget. Neoptolemus turned as all trained men turn, with weight dropping into the legs and eyes finding the source. He saw Orestes and the old inheritance of the house of Atreus that teaches a man to answer blood with blood and to take the consequence afterward from whatever hand gives it. He saw the sacred rope in the corner of his sight. He saw the priest's staff lift again. He saw the spear butt of a guard thrust forward, not to kill, but to remove. In the pulse between one breath and the next, the bright son of Achilles stood within a snare made of law and private purpose. The altar was near. Everything happens near altars if it is to be remembered. The smoke of the morning's ram still drifted in the beam of light that fell from the roof opening. Ash lay on the polished stone like a frost that never melts. Neoptolemus stumbled backward from the first strike, and his shoulder found the cold edge. A temple boy cried out, and choked the sound back into his mouth. Someone spoke Apollo's name with a care that sounded almost like apology. Orestes came in under the priest's reaching arm, the way a man comes under a shield rim, and put the point where the heart works. This is one ending. It is clean in the mouth and foul in the throat. It says that the old promise to Orestes was paid in a single savage account, and that the sanctuary kept its show of innocence by allowing a mortal to do what the god would not be seen to do. In the other ending, the priests themselves finished it. Macarius struck again, and the king who had stormed a city crumpled where no shield wall could rise to meet the blow. The guards of Delphi made a ring. The rules were declared unbroken because the rules had spoken. The body bled against stone chosen by a god, and the stain entered the memory of the place, so that even in later winters, men would say, here is where pride failed before law. It is the sort of ending priests prefer, and perhaps the sort gods prefer as well. Men can live with a clean story. The truth may have been muddier and more human than either. There are witnesses who swore that as Neoptolemus fell, he kept one hand open, an empty palm toward the god, as if to ask for the fairness that had not come. There are others who said he tried to rise, and that 3 men held him because even falling he looked like a man who might yet sever the day from its intended course. There are a few who said nothing at all for the rest of their lives about Delphi except to recite the titles by which Apollo is named, which is an answer that covers many things without admitting any. Silence spread through the precinct the way oil spreads on water. It found every corner and lay there with a shine that made men blink. The attendants moved with trained hands to purify what could be purified and to remove what could not remain. A litter was brought that had carried elders in triumph at festivals and now bore a young king to a colder room. A single bright line of blood crossed the lip of the altar stone and dried there in the afternoon. The Pythia never appeared. She did not need to. The god had spoken in the only language men never forget. Word fled faster than the men who carried it. It ran down to the treasuries and into the shade where merchants counted their small victories. It ran to the Castalian spring where women cupped water with serious hands and pretended their ears were not full of news. It ran along the road where soldiers guarded the bend that bands of thieves favor, and it ran past them with a speed that thieves respect. It reached the lower villages by nightfall and the coast by the next morning. It reached Epirus in the hard voice of a rider who had not slept. It reached Phthia and laid itself down at the feet of Peleus, like an old dog that knows it has brought a bad thing home and waits for the hand that will not strike. The old man did not tear his hair. He had outlived too many shapes of grief to bring custom to this one. He sat very straight and looked at the place on the floor where Achilles had once stood when he was a boy who could not keep still. Then he gave orders in a voice the servants could hear without weeping. Messengers went out like arrows. Offerings were prepared for the tombs of the line. A small troop made ready to ride to Delphi, not to storm it, but to ask for the body with words measured to the dignity of men who have already paid too much for their pride. In Epirus, the house did not cheer when the news came. It did not mourn aloud either. Andromache gathered the boy close and felt the old lesson press its seal upon a newer one. She had survived the end of Troy. She would survive this. The women of the court moved like careful water around a rock that had fallen into a shallow stream. They kept the sounds of daily life alive so that the walls would not learn to listen for wailing. They set food where food should be, and they swept where floors must be clean, and they kept their tongues still because gossip is a fire, and there had been enough fire. In Sparta, the tale arrived in a more tangled thread. Some versions placed Orestes at the center as actor and avenger. Some placed him at the edge as witness and beneficiary. Menelaus listened without blinking. He held the balance in his mind as he always did. In both versions, the oath he had made at Troy had been carried to its bitter end. In both versions, his daughter stood now in the custody of the man to whom she had first been promised by Tyndareus in rooms that smelled of oil and old cedar. In either case, the world would say, Sparta keeps its word, because Sparta makes its words line up in the end even if the way between is dark. If you ask Delphi, it will tell you nothing new. The sanctuary offered purification for the blood that had fallen within its lines. It offered words to cover the actions of its servants if its servants had acted. It accepted gifts from those who preferred the tale that set Orestes' hand to the work, and gifts from those who preferred the tale that set the gods' anger in mortal arms. The omphalos sat with its familiar indifference. The laurel rustled and meant whatever men needed it to mean. Hermione did not stand in the temple porch when the blow fell. She learned of it on the road where the dust clings to the sandals and the sun makes a white band along a spear shaft at noon. Her reaction was neither triumph nor horror. It was a steadiness that looked strange on a face that had not been made for such heaviness. Orestes told her with the economy of a man who has learned that words can be either lids or blades. He did not blame the god. He did not absolve himself. He said only that a reckoning had come, and that a debt that had snarled 2 houses had found its bitter coin. They reached Argos by stages suitable to a royal bride who is not meant to look like a fugitive. At each stop, the elders who preferred the older promise came forward and spoke as if the scroll they had kept wrapped in their memories had finally been unrolled. In the markets, women murmured that Helen's daughter had come at last to the place where her grandfather's word had placed her first. In the men's courts, captains measured Orestes with their eyes and decided that a man haunted by furies can still keep a city if he has learned to keep himself. Priests found omens in fire and in the splittings of liver that agreed with the mood of their audiences. The great houses sent gifts that congratulated without saying on what. Argos wakes early. The light comes low across the plain and slides up the citadel until stone that was grey at dawn turns the color of bread just pulled from an oven. On such a morning, the city looked up and saw a procession take the slope like a slow river. At its head rode Orestes, the last son of the house that had ruled these streets since men first learned to bind a wall with fitted blocks. Beside him went Hermione, veiled according to the old custom, not hidden, only tempered. The way you shade the eyes before you look at the Sunday. There had been years of wandering for the man. Furies are not an invention for the stage. They are a way of telling the truth about a mind that has been asked to bear more than it was made to carry. Orestes had sought the god's release at Delphi and had carried a ruling home from Athens, where a new court stood on bare rock and weighed murders that divided blood from duty. Men called it the Hill of Ares and said that Athena herself gave the casting vote that frees a house without unmaking law. That judgment had been earned with offerings and with a kind of humility that no prince enjoys. Now the verdict had weathered a few winters. The fits had grown fewer. The hand that once shook on the cup was steady more days than not. Argos watched the rider climb and measured whether the past still clung to him like a smell, or whether a city could stake its quiet upon his name. The rites for the marriage were set out as if a scribe had taken from a chest an old scroll and found it whole. The elders of Argos and the great men of Mycenae met on the broad stair before the palace, where Agamemnon had once stood in a cloak that had been woven to hide murder in its folds. They greeted the bride with courtesy that did not try to look like love, and greeted the groom with loyalty that did not try to look like fear. Priests of Hera came first, since Hera loves the bond that ties houses without breaking either. Priests of Athena followed with quiet words about rule that lasts longer than a season. There was libation to Zeus of the household, because a marriage draws a new circle that must be protected from within as much as from without. Helen's daughter knew the forms. She had moved through more than one palace and had learned how ceremony can turn a crowd into a single witness and a promise into a thing that can be seen and touched. She stood beside Orestes with the poise Sparta had hammered into her and with a softness that belonged only to her. When her veil was lifted, she did not blink. She let Argos see that Menelaus's iron and Helen's brightness could live in one face without quarreling. The hall murmured in a way that bodes well for queens. It is not clamor. It is a settling sound, as when men adjust their cloaks because they think they will be sitting here a while. The vows were neither sweet nor new. They were the old words that outlived the men who first spoke them. Orestes gave gifts in public that reminded every watcher that a king is rich because his city is rich, not the other way around. Gold from storerooms that had stood locked since before the war. Linens from Egypt that had made their way to the Argive Gulf by merchants who braved storms and taxes with equal patience. Horses from the same plains where Danaus's daughters once came with their jars and their difficult history. Hermione answered with the dowry a Spartan king had prepared, fine armor that had been fitted in Helos. Chests of oil from groves that kept their fruit even in lean years, because the women who kept them were tireless and did not miss a worm. Tablets that tallied estates offered to Argive temples in the bride's name. Between the two of them, they made public what a marriage should always make public to a city. We are not a new appetite come to feed. We are a new wall come to stand. There was politics beneath the feast as always. Sparta and Argos had feinted and fenced since before boys learned their first letters. This binding of daughter and son was a rope knotted across an old fault. Menelaus sent words that were short and solid. The king of Sparta recognized his cousin as the rightful lord in Argos and Mycenae and stood ready to send spears if the old quarrels tried to walk again. He sent servants who could whisper that the hand which once pledged a daughter to Achilles' line now placed her where Tyndareus had first pointed. The elders nodded as men nod who see the top edge of a problem shaved off without entirely dulling the blade. Hermione learned the pulse of her new city with the speed of someone who has taken 3 courts into her bones already. Argos does not move like Sparta. There the speech runs with more adornment, and the people take pride in processions that Athens would envy. The marketplace talks to the council as much as the council talks to the marketplace. A queen who wishes to last learns the names of potters and coppersmiths and the men who lead the river water into channels that make barley grow where last year it did not. She took her place beside Orestes in judgment on set days, and she knew when to be absent so that the king's sentence would land clean and not look coached by a stronger mind at his shoulder. She went to the temples with rhythm, but without display. Hera's great shrine at Prosimna received her first, because marriage requires courage dressed in gentleness. Athena's precinct above the city received her next, because rule requires gentleness dressed in courage. She set a lock of hair at the tomb of Agamemnon without staging it for the crowd. She did it for the peace of a house and for the sake of servants who still cross themselves when they pass the place. She honored Clytemnestra's memory with quiet bread and quiet wine. That act was not throat-clearing for the poets. It was the work of a woman who understands that a city learns from its rulers how to carry hard truths. If the queen can stand before the tomb of the murdered and the murderer and keep her face composed, then perhaps the people can learn to stop using those names as daggers and use them as warnings instead. There were trials to face that were not written on tablets. Healers came and went with their little boxes and their simple asks. Eat this herb when the moon is new. Sleep more and walk the walls at noon, when the heat lays a hand on the brow and quiets the chatter that steals strength. Orestes met those hours with a candid stubbornness that servants came to respect. There were days when the old terrors crept back from the corners and stood at the foot of the bed like judges who have remembered a point of law. On those days, Hermione did not call for flutes or for priests. She set the room in order with her own hands and spoke to her husband of inventories and roads and the names of petitioners scheduled for the next morning. She would remind him that the world was large and solid and entirely unawed by memories. It is a plain trick, and it often works. The city began to breathe, as a city breathes when it trusts its mornings. Roads were repaired that merchants had learned to avoid. Border stones were set again where small lords had nudged them with their heels. The harbor that takes Peloponnesian ships grew busier and a little more honest. The tax collectors learned to count properly under eyes that knew their sums from long practice. Hermione order settled into Argive habit. The singers found a new stanza for their night songs. The last daughter of the Trojan war generation had come at last into a place where her hands were not ornaments but tools. Then came the news that every hall waits for after a queen has been seated. A midwife left a warm room at dawn with her hair uncombed and her eyes bright and told the door guards to pass the word. Hermione had borne a son. The house took the news the way dry earth takes the first rain. It spread through rooms and through lanes and out past the goat pens and the olive yards. Tisamenus. The name meant something like brave at the assembly if you pulled at its threads. It pleased the elders who prefer a boy who will one day speak where men listen and not merely ride where men cheer. Ceremony followed, as ceremony always follows births of consequence. The child was carried in clean cloth to altars within the palace, and then to the city shrine. The king gave gifts to the poor that were real and not performed. Oil and bread and coin that can be spent by men who know the value of coin. A few prisoners were released, who could be trusted not to make the city regret it. The child smelled of milk and of the old hope that runs through every civilization like a buried spring. Old women who had seen too much wept without hiding it. Men who had pretended not to worry about heirs, allowed themselves to laugh too loudly at jokes and to clap one another on the shoulders as if triumph belonged to them. For Hermione, the hour was a private correction written upon a public page. The long fear that had hollowed her in Epirus now had an answer. No spell had governed her body. No god had closed a hand over her life. She held the boy and felt possession tempered by an understanding that belongs only to those who have counted themselves childless and then are not. She placed his small fist around the edge of a seal ring and told herself a simple, true thing. My worth never sat in this cradle. My joy does. Those who watched her saw the composure of a queen and missed the smaller loosening inside her, where a terrible knot had undone itself at last. With the child, the politics deepened and softened in the same breath. Sparta sent richer gifts than protocol required and spoke of the boy as a bridge between plains and valley. Envoys from Epirus arrived with correct words and careful faces. There was no profit in wounding a house that had learned to survive every blade turned against it. The priests composed new prayers that mentioned Tisamenus by name and asked that he be made wise rather than merely mighty. The city liked that. Men have learned to fear boys who are only mighty. the court took its shape around the new center. Orestes resumed the steady grind of rule, and found that the baby's small breathing at night worked on his mind, like a soft hand laid on the shoulder of a man who has forgotten he is not alone. Hermione returned to audiences and to ledgers, and to the endless small mercies that make a palace feel like a home rather than a machine. The household learned to move around a cradle without hushing itself into worship. Laughter did not offend the child. Loud voices did not crack him. The dogs learned to curl under the chair where the wet nurse Saturday. The seasons turned. If one looked down from the walls toward the plain in the warm hour of late afternoon, the fields showed a color that had been missing in years of fear. Grain high enough to move like water. Vines tied with the careful hands of men who expected to be alive in autumn. The city is quick to borrow the mood of its rulers. Argos had borrowed steadiness and hope, and a useful memory that kept the ghosts in their rooms and did not let them dine at every table. A queen had come to her intended place. A king had found the part of his mind that could be ruled. A child slept with his fist clenched, as if even in dreams he planned to hold fast to this world. Peace in Argos is never a still pond. It is a river that runs with banks that look firm until the spring floods come down from the hills. The marriage had steadied the court. The birth of Tisamenus had given the city a face to turn toward tomorrow. Yet those who kept the old lists knew that the reckoning promised to the sons of Heracles was nearing its hour. In border towns, men spoke of scouts from the north who asked too many questions about passes and fords. In the temples, the priests found omens that could be read two ways, and chose the older reading because it let them keep their dignity. The name they whispered was the old one, the return. They wore many names, the Heraclidae, the descendants of the man who had bent a bow that no other could bend and had hauled the weight of the world for a breath while another caught his. In dry seasons, they were exiles with a pedigree and patience. In wet seasons, they were a flood. A generation had grown into its strength since the first failed marches toward the Peloponnese. Now they gathered under leaders who had learned prudence from the arrogance of their fathers. They counted the small kings who would profit from a change in the larger house. They found allies among men who had grown tired of paying old taxes to old lines. A people that believes the gods favor it does not knock twice when it sees a gate begin to give. Orestes understood the shape of the threat, the way an old hunter understands the shape of a spoor. He met with captains whose hands were calloused from real service and not from moving pieces on a board. He sent word to Sparta that spears might soon be needed. Menelaus answered with the heavy consent of a man who had hoped to lay his sword on its pegs and teach a grandson to ride instead. The two houses still stood back to back in public. In private, each counted the fields it must strip for grain, and the men it could afford to call away from vineyards that had just begun to forgive the years of neglect. Age does not ask a king for leave to enter. Orestes felt it in the early darkness behind his eyes and in the shortness of breath that no physician could smooth for long. The old fits visited sometimes like distant kinsmen who have learned to knock before they enter. He bore them without drama. In council, he was still the man who could set a room into a single mind with 3 sentences. In judgment, he was still the mind that could hear 2 truths and measure which must be allowed to live. But when he walked the walls at sunset with Hermione, his hand sometimes found the stones as men find furniture in the dark. He spoke more often of Argos as a bequest than as a possession. The end came without the theatre that poets love. Some said he died of sickness that gathered from many winters. Some said a serpent in Arcadia found the soft place that even a king cannot shield. Both tales agree on what matters. The ruler of Argos and Mycenae left a realm that had begun to believe in itself again. A bier was set out within the palace. The people passed in steady lines and left sprigs of laurel or a pinch of barley, or nothing at all but a look that said they remembered when law had been thin and fear plentiful. The tomb at Tegea kept his bones if you accept the oldest reports. Later, men moved those bones or said that they did, which is how the living bargain with the dead when they need a sign that favors their side. Hermione bore the mourning with the same grave measure with which she had borne the wedding. She sat where widowed queens sit, at a height that lets the people see her and keeps them from touching the black of her sleeve. She listened to petitions because cities do not stop being cities when a king dies. She named the day when the black veil would be put aside for the work veil that admits labor. When she spoke to her son, there was no tremor. The boy fixed on the cool steadiness in her voice in the way a child fixes on a landmark in a storm. He knew the world had shifted. He knew his mother would not let him be required to prove it every hour. Tisamenus did not wait long to be named what he already was. The kingship fell to him not only because blood demanded it, but because the elders knew that a realm with two minds invites the kind of visitor already camped beyond the passes. The lad stood at the altar and accepted the diadem from hands that had placed it once upon his father. He did not look like Menelaus, and he did not look like Agamemnon. He looked like Tisamenus, which is to say he looked like a youth who knows the world has given him more than most and expects him to pay for it without complaint. Hermione stood behind him with the posture that courts remember when they tell stories about proper bearing. The Heraclidae did not send bards. They sent heralds. Their message was plain. The lands of their ancestor were theirs by right and by the will of those gods who had once made room for Heracles on Olympus. They would take them now with piety and with force. The river crossings filled with men who had walked from the north with good sandals and better discipline. The narrow places where stones and spears talked to one another grew crowded with small fights that end neither war nor argument, but make both louder. The Peloponnese felt the old board shift under its feet. The war that followed is told differently in each city that survived it. In Argive telling, Tisamenus held the gates with a courage that made old soldiers look at one another and remember why they had sworn the oaths their mouths had grown tired of. In Spartan telling, the last Atreid king stood and fell and stood again, while messengers ran south to ask for lines of shields that could not arrive in time. In the tales of the invaders, justice walked in at last and found the chair that had been kept warm for it for 3 generations. The names of the Heraclid leaders come and go in these lists like fish in moving water. Hyllus had failed in an earlier generation. Now men spoke of Temenus and Cresphontes and Aristodemus and their sons, who would divide the peninsula as a man divides a cloak among brothers. The decisive fight broke a few miles from Argos, near ground that has seen too many flags to care which color flies next. Later singers called it the Battle of Cleone. Others put it nearer to Corinth. What endured was the end of a line rather than the choice of a field. Tisamenus led what he could gather. Veterans with scars that no longer hurt until it rained. Young men eager to prove that the songs remember fresh faces. Allies who looked at the sky more than at their captains, as if weather might yet decide. The Heraclidae had the cold blessing of a story that had waited too long to be fulfilled. They had ordered the way a new tool has a perfect edge. Hermione did not ride to the field. She did the work that makes battles possible and survivable both. She set the temples in order and named which gods must receive which vows, so that the city would not find itself out of ritual at the worst hour. She sent for carts and clean cloth and wine for wounds and men, to drive the carts who would not stop when they began to hear the sounds that make drivers stop. She stood in the court and listened to mothers who needed to be allowed to fear out loud before they could send their sons away without breaking them. She saw that the walls had water at hand and arrows stacked where arrows should be stacked. She did not ask for reports every hour. Captains do not write messages in the middle of a push. She waited and made waiting look like patience rather than helplessness. The news that returned was severed. The first runner said the line had held and that the boy king had spoken like a man and moved like one. The second said the left had given a little and caught itself. The third had blood to the knee and forgot half his rehearsed message when he reached the palace. Then there was the long gap that makes a city listen for sounds beyond its own walls. The fourth came at last with a face that had already given all the tears it had to give. The cry moved through Argos as wind moves in tall wheat. Tisamenus had fallen. Some said he died at the hands of the sons of Aristomachus. Some said he stood until the last of his guard were down, and then he sank like a post in soft ground. He died as men who carry many names die, with none of them on his lips. He died as kings die, which is to say he made of his body a wall for a little while, and then the wall failed. A line does not end in a single afternoon only because swords are sharp. It ends because the time around it has decided to turn. The Atreid rule in the Peloponnese was over. The Heraclidae parcelled the land and scrawled new lines on parchment and on maps inside their heads. Argos would be ruled by Temenus and his house. Sparta would be given to twin brothers with names that sounded like the steady beat of a war drum. Messene would be granted to another branch. The old gears found new teeth and ground on. The people did what people do. They learned new names for old taxes and went back to the fields when the smoke cleared. Hermione's work did not stop when the line broke. She took from the temples what offerings could be used and returned what must not be touched. She opened the stores to the widows first, and then to the children whose fathers had not come to claim them at dusk. She received the Heraclid envoys with a face that did not shake, and secured terms that kept Argive houses from being torn board from board. No queen could do more in that hour. Many would have done less. When the city had steadied enough to stand without a hand at its back, she stepped out of the hall and let the new order step in. Some say she went then to Sparta and lived in quiet near the river that had learned her name in childhood. Some say she followed her son's allies east across the water with the last of the Atreids, who made new homes in towns that would one day be called by names unfamiliar to men of the Bronze Age. All agree that she did not beg. All agree that she did not curse. At night, in those last weeks before she left the palace for the last time, she walked once more the line of rooms that had become the memory palace of her life. The chair where Orestes had found steadiness after storms. The doorway where the midwife had stood, with hair untidy and joy in her face. The table where elders had learned to fold their angers under their cloaks before they entered. She did not take a stone. A city is not made safer by souvenirs. She took the ring that had sealed her judgments, and the comb that had smoothed her hair the morning she laid her hand upon a child's cradle and whispered his name where only the gods could hear. Men will argue in later years about where her path went next and where it ended. They will say that she found rest in a place where the air smells of meadows after rain, and that she was not long alone there. They will put her in Elysium with her parents, which is a kind conclusion and may even be true. They will say other things that belong to the next telling. What belongs to this one is simpler. A daughter of Sparta weathered a century that asked more of her than it asked of most kings. She carried her house through war and homecoming and oath and exile, and set it down as carefully as a cup of oil in a flame-lit room. The last pages of a life as hard used as Hermione's do not turn loudly. They turn with the hush of a library when evening falls. The old poets were not kind to her in their attention. They were busy with brighter conflagrations and noisier kings. Yet the record that remains is enough, if read with patience. It shows a woman whose story completes a circle that began with an oath in Sparta and roared through Troy and ended in a quieter light than any battlefield could offer. The oldest comfort set down by singers and priests is simple. Menelaus, spared by the gods and made dear to them through long suffering, would not die as other men die. The Isle of the Blessed would receive him. Helen, whose beauty had been a curse to nations and a riddle to priests, would share that rest. The tradition is steady enough that even sober men repeat it without embarrassment. When the great pair crossed beyond the day, Elysium opened as if a familiar guest had tapped at a familiar door. In some tellings, Hermione follows, not by privilege stolen from brighter names, but as the daughter whose life had been spent in the stewardship of their consequences. A household that had shaken the world came at last to a peace that the world could not bruise. Not every witness agrees on the details of that peace. Antiquity kept many cupboards and did not always label them. A very old verse, preserved by later hands that loved to save curiosities, whispers that when Diomedes took on a brightness not meant for mortal flesh, he found a companion in Hermione. The line is no more than a strand of thread and must be handled like one. It shows the way stories reach for symmetry after a season of wounds. The hero who fought beside Menelaus and Odysseus would keep company with the child of Menelaus and the wife of Odysseus's kinsman. A circle made tidy for minds that long for tidiness. Believe it if you must. No law compels it. The better truth is that Hermione's shade, however placed, is imagined among the reconciled, far from the cold arithmetic of mortal courts. What the living can weigh more securely is her shape upon the ground she walked. Through her, the house of Atreus and the house of Sparta clasped hands more than once without letting pride turn the grip to a wrench. Through her, the last strong claim of Achilles' name touched land in the western hills where Dodona murmurs. Through her, the Argive throne found a queen who preferred sound bread to sweet speech, who fixed roads and tallied stores and listened to petitioners until their anger cooled of its own accord. She stood between the Bronze Age and what followed, a hinge upon which a door moved from one world to another. When the Heraclidae came with their old warrant and their new patience, when the last fires of the war generation sank to coals, she did not scream at the wind. She set things in order and walked on. Even the stones remember something of her. In the Argolid, there stood a coastal city that bore a name close to hers, a place of ship sheds and quiet harbors and old altars. Scholars have argued whether the town gave its name to the woman or the woman to the town. The ancient habit is to make the land and the lineages answer one another with a nod. It is enough for memory that the syllables were kin. Men said Hermione and meant the city where Poseidon had an older claim than most. Men said Hermione and meant the daughter whose footsteps crossed the peninsula like a shadow at afternoon. Place and person together remind us that Greece is a country where myths and maps lean over the same table. Her significance does not scream, it accrues. In each text where she appears briefly, the scene steadies because her presence makes other people answer to their oaths. In Homer, she is a prize of lineage, golden as the goddess herself, a promise that the royal blood will not run thin. In Euripides, she is a figure written with brutal honesty. First, a young wife sharpened to cruelty by fear, then a woman carried at last into the marriage that had been pledged for her before she could speak. In the travel notes of later elders, she is recalled as the mother of a last king, and as one more thread by which the old tapestry insisted on holding together long after new fingers had begun to pull. The facts are not grand. They are adamant. She was a node where houses met. She was a bridge between anger and order. She was the quiet master of a ledger that kept Greece from overdrawing what dignity it had left. The image that remains is not of a queen on a throne. It is of a woman in a doorway at dusk. Behind her lie courts that have seen too much light and too much smoke. Before her lies a street with ordinary voices. She holds both without flinching. She has learned the cost of fame by watching it age her parents. She has learned the cost of vengeance by hearing it ring through her uncle's house. She has learned the cost of ambition by living under the roof of a man whose very breath quickened the pulse of war. She has learned the cost of patience by waiting for a child, and by waiting for a city to take her measure, and by waiting for history to stop passing its bill through her hands. The gods favored louder names. The poets chased brighter torches. Yet, when the long sum is done, Hermione stands at the center of the reckoning. Through her, the last sparks of the Trojan fire were carried into a safer pasture and allowed to die. Through her, a dynasty found its final heir and gave him back to the land with honor when the time came. Through her, the work of putting rooms in order and keeping ledgers clean, and seeing that the old are warmed and the young trained, did not fall through the cracks while men spoke about glory. This is not a small legacy. It is the Commonwealth itself, folded into a single life and given shape by a single will. Imagine then the final scene that does not need gold leaf to be remembered. A plain meadow, a wind that smells of grass and of the faint salt the world always keeps in reserve. A figure that turns at the sound of footsteps she knows. A father whose temper has cooled and whose eyes have forgotten their blaze. A mother who at last is only a mother and not a cautionary tale. Their daughter steps toward them without urgency. They are no longer kings. They are no longer the measure by which nations test themselves. They are a family that history has finished with. That is mercy enough. Let the poets have their louder paradises. This one will serve.